The White House followed Donald Trump's latest social media post with what can only be described as a train wreck press conference. Trump had just suggested online that he was trying to reach some kind of understanding with Minnesota Governor Tim Walz. Around the same time, Walz publicly said he'd had productive conversations with Trump about pulling back federal agents ICE and Border Patrol from Minnesota and allowing an independent investigation into the Minneapolis shootings. Then came the press briefing, and everything unraveled. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt took the podium and immediately went on the offensive, blaming Minnesota's Democratic leadership for the violence. She claimed that Governor Walz and Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey were directly responsible for the deaths of Renee Nicole Good and Alex Prey, arguing that sanctuary city policies and resistance to federal immigration enforcement led to the tragedy.
Yet Democrat leaders in Minnesota with sanctuary city policies have actively defied federal immigration law and the will of the people. And as a result of that defiance, 2 Minnesotans have now tragically lost their lives on the streets of Tim Walz's state.
Her message was blunt. This never would have happened if Democratic leaders hadn't pushed back against ICE and Border Patrol.
But let's be clear about the circumstances which led to that moment on Saturday. This tragedy occurred as a result of a deliberate and hostile resistance by Democrat leaders in Minnesota. For weeks, Governor Walz and the Mayor Jacob Frey and other elected Democrats were spreading lies about federal law enforcement officers who are risking their lives daily to remove the worst criminal illegal aliens from our streets: murderers, rapists, pedophiles, human traffickers, and gang members.
She doubled down moments later, saying the killings were the result of what she called deliberate and hostile resistance by Minnesota officials, accusing them of spreading lies about federal agents who, in her words, were simply trying to remove the worst of the worst from American streets. But that framing raised immediate backlash. Instead of addressing concerns about accountability or the conduct of federal agents, the administration appeared to escalate, labeling Alex Prey a domestic terrorist, an assassin, and someone who intended to massacre law enforcement. This was said despite the fact that the incident is still under investigation and video evidence is publicly available.
To your first question, the answer is yes. He still has confidence and trust in Secretary Noem. To the second question,
Leavitt also suggested that any gun owner who shows up to a protest while armed should assume the risk of being killed if confronted by law enforcement. That comment sparked outrage, especially given that Alex Prey reportedly had a legal concealed carry permit. Critics pointed out the hypocrisy after years of MAGA leaders portraying themselves as fierce defenders of the Second Amendment. The White House now seemed eager to discard it when inconvenient.
Thank you, Caroline. FBI Director Kash Patel said in a Sunday interview, quote, "You cannot bring a firearm loaded with multiple magazines to any sort of protest." Does the president believe the Second Amendment rights remain in effect even with protesting?
The president supports the Second Amendment rights of law-abiding American citizens. Absolutely. There has been no greater supporter or defender of the right to bear arms than President Donald J. Trump. So while Americans have a constitutional right to bear arms, Americans do not have a constitutional right to impede lawful immigration enforcement operations. And any gun owner knows that when you are carrying a weapon, when you are bearing arms and you are confronted by law enforcement, you are raising the assumption of risk and the risk of force being used against you. And again, that's unfortunately what took place on Saturday.
When pressed about Trump's own posts claiming there was a cover-up and fraud in Minnesota, Leavitt shifted gears. She alleged widespread corruption in the state, claimed billions had been stolen from taxpayers, and even hinted without evidence that Congresswoman Ilhan Omar could be connected to fraud rings.
I'll take a couple more. Go ahead.
Okay, so this weekend the president posted that this is a cover-up of the fraud in the state of Minnesota. He also posted Minnesota is a cover-up. These both happened after the shooting. So, given that these came after the shooting, what is the this here? What is the cover-up he's alleging?
Yes, it's a good question. I've spoken with the president about this at length. What the president is referring to is the fact that you have Governor Walz and, again, the mayor, who have been encouraging these left-wing agitators to come out and to harass and to dox and to threaten ICE and to make this conversation about and smear lies about federal law enforcement who, again, are just trying to do their jobs in an attempt to distract from the widespread massive fraud that has taken place in their state. Billions and billions of dollars has been stolen from law-abiding taxpayers in Minnesota, and the administration continues to be very focused on getting to the bottom of it, especially, and the president raised a good question over the weekend with respect to Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, who now has a net worth within the millions. And one must ask themselves, why and how is that possible? Is she connected to the fraud rings that we have seen taking place within her state and her own district? It's a question the American people are raising, and the president believes it's one worth answering.
No proof was offered. Just insinuation. Reporters also noticed the contradiction in tone. Trump had publicly described his call with Governor Walz as respectful and productive, saying they were on the same wavelength. Leavitt, meanwhile, was scorched earth painting Minnesota as lawless and its leaders as dangerous agitators. Asked to explain the disconnect, she argued that Trump's productive conversation only happened because of the pressure created by the administration's hardline stance. Throughout the briefing, officials repeatedly jumped to conclusions before facts were established, calling Prey a terrorist, labeling the incident an attack on law enforcement, then later insisting the investigation was ongoing and incomplete.
Top officials referring to him in that way, rushing to that judgment?
Danny, go ahead.
Thanks, Caroline. On Stephen Miller's comments, will Stephen Miller be apologising to the family of Alex Pretty for calling him, quote, an assassin who tried to murder federal agents, despite the fact that, as you say, this is still under investigation?
Look, again, this incident remains under investigation, and nobody here at the White House, including the President of the United States, wants to see Americans hurt or killed and losing their lives in American streets. And we mourn for the parents. As a mother myself, of course, I cannot imagine the loss of life, especially losing one's child. And that same empathy from the President goes for the parents of angel families and parents of victims of illegal alien crime across our country as well. And that's exactly why the president continues to be wholeheartedly committed to deporting the worst of the worst criminals from our country.
Prior to the call with Governor Walz this morning, the president described it as respectful. He said, we seem to be on a similar wavelength, but you had strong criticism for the governor and the Minneapolis mayor, Jacob Frey, just now. So could you explain the difference in tone between what the president had said in his True Social post and I think some of the criticisms that you just levied through the podium?
Fran, I think the criticisms that I laid out, I'm painting the picture for all of you in this room, are what led to the moment that we are in today, where Governor Walz and President Trump are having a conversation, a constructive and productive conversation to end the chaos and the lawlessness that has taken place in Governor Walz's state.
Leavitt also claimed overwhelming public support for ICE and Border Patrol operations, citing polling that shows Americans favor deporting violent criminals. Critics countered that this talking point ignores what's actually happening on the ground. Peaceful protesters, people with no criminal records, even children being targeted or swept up in enforcement actions.
Thank you, Caroline. Regarding Minnesota, on Saturday, the Department of Homeland Security posted that Pretty looks like he wanted to do maximum damage and massacre law enforcement. Stephen Miller on Saturday posted that, or called Pretty a would-be assassin. Why did administration officials jump to conclusions before an investigation had even been conducted?
Well, look, this has obviously been a very fluid and fast-moving situation throughout the weekend. As for President Trump, whom I speak for, he has said that he wants to let the investigation continue and let the facts lead in this case. Fran.
Caroline, is it the White House's position that Americans have the right to show up to these ICE operations and film, document, or protest the law enforcement actions?
All Americans have a First Amendment constitutional right, of course, but Americans do not have a constitutional right to impede and obstruct lawful immigration enforcement operations. That is actually a crime, and it's something that we've seen taking place in the streets of Minneapolis, which again is leading to these dangerous circumstances that these federal law enforcement officers have been forced to work within.
By the end of the day, Governor Walz again stated publicly that he had urged Trump to reduce the federal presence in Minnesota and allow an impartial investigation. Trump responded online saying the call was good and that he would look into it. But many remain skeptical. Trump's words, critics argue, have rarely matched his actions. His history of broken promises and aggressive tactics leaves little confidence that anything will change. To them, this press conference wasn't about justice or transparency. It was about deflection, escalation, and controlling the narrative. That's what made it so dangerous. Let me know what you think.
Elena.
Thank you. I had a question. With Homan now going to Minnesota, is Gregory Bovino also going to remain in Minnesota overseeing these ICE operations?
Mr. Bovino is a wonderful man and he's a great professional. He is going to very much continue to lead Customs and Border Patrol throughout and across the country. Mr. Homan will be the main point of contact on the ground in Minneapolis. It is President Trump's hope and wish and demand for the resistance and chaos to end today. Mary.
Thanks, Caroline. To follow on Gabe's question, Secretary Noem said Alex Preddy committed an act of domestic terrorism. Stephen Miller labeled Preddy a domestic terrorist. Does the president agree with that?
Look, as I've said, I have not heard the president characterize Mr. Preddy in that way. However, I have heard the president say he wants to let the facts in the investigation lead itself.
Was he alarmed to hear his top officials referring to him in that way, rushing to that judgment?
Aliens, of which there are still hundreds of thousands to deport from the interior of our country. The most peaceful way to carry out this vital public safety mission is for Republicans and Democrats to do it together and for state and local law enforcement to work together with federal law enforcement. We want to let cops be cops. You wouldn't know this continues to be a very popular policy position from the biased media coverage over the course of the last few days. But polling shows huge support for this exact thing President Trump is calling for. More than 80% of Americans favor deporting illegal aliens convicted of violent crimes. A country unable to deport criminals who enter it illegally is no country at all.